And so for background, we know David Crane, former CEO of NRG Energy. Next to him is Shane Skelton. He's a partner at consulting firm S2C Pacific. He's also a former energy advisor to Paul Ryan. And we have Brandon Hurlbut, former chief of staff at the Department of Energy under Secretary Chu and a former Obama staffer, now a partner at consulting firm Boundary Stone Partners. So to everyone listening at home, we're coming to you today from the Sun Valley Forum in Ketchum, Idaho. I'm currently sitting on stage with our podcast co-hosts, Brandon Hurlbut, our Democrat, and Shane Skelton, our Republican. And then we have a great guest this episode, David Crane, former CEO of NRG Energy, a large independent power producer. So he is here to be the pragmatic businessman, to give the pragmatic businessman's perspective on climate politics. That's where I meant to say the businessman remark, so sorry again, Mike. So we're here in beautiful Sun Valley, but the interesting thing is we flew from LA through the smoke. And for me, it was interesting because it was a real wake-up call to this new reality we're talking about of wildfires, of drought. And Shane, you didn't bring your children this week because of that. Can you just mention that briefly?
Yeah, so we were gonna have a family trip, and yesterday, I guess 2 days ago when we came out, I was calling whoever I could call in Ketchum and Sun Valley to try to get a sense of the air quality. And I got a wide range of feedback, but most of it was, not good. And so we have a 10-month-old, we have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I just didn't want them breathing in that smoke. I know you're gonna get to this, but it's interesting, and I've had this in an exchange with Amy as well, that when stuff impacts you personally, you pay a lot more attention to it. And so I really didn't care about climate issues at all until 2013 when Idaho burnt down. And similarly, I was coming out here with my family, and I at the time was responsible for the interior accounts on the budget committee, working for then Budget Chairman Ryan. And we were constantly fighting with the Obama administration about money, and I just didn't care, right? I mean, it wasn't a priority for me, at least, and for my boss at the time. I shouldn't say didn't care. I mean, it wasn't a priority. It wasn't where you wanted to spend your money. And then you come out and you see how it's impacting people, personally, but then also the community, and it becomes very, very real. So these issues are interesting, from a policy standpoint, but also from a personal perspective.
Yeah, so we have a Republican who believes in climate change. Let's just let the record show.
I feel like there's a bunch, Julia.
Yeah, should we applause? That's a question. There's an applause.
All right, that might be the only one I get, so.
But, Julia, for the Republicans that say dealing with climate change will be expensive, it's just a good example that we're already paying for it. I mean, what's the bill going to be for all these wildfires and hurricanes and such?
Absolutely. So the temperatures are rising, wildfires are raging, drought conditions are spreading, storms are intensifying, and the midterm elections are less than 100 days away. So it seems a little bit petty to talk about politics maybe in the midst of this crazy global transition and shift, and a dangerous shift that we're experiencing with climate change. But it's so key how cities and states and the federal government, ultimately the planet, the policies that all these entities put in place will affect how well we adapt and mitigate climate change. So the politics do matter, and that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. So again, this is Political Climate. We share perspectives across the political spectrum on today's most pressing energy and environmental issues. And being bipartisan in today's world is actually kind of hard. I'm Canadian, so I'm nice to everybody. But seriously, there's a lot of anger out there, and we're trying to create a bipartisan conversation, but we also don't want to force it. We're not trying to pretend like things are all hunky-dory when they're not. So this episode, we're going to try and get at some of that tension. And to kick things off, I want to orient around this one article that came out in the New York Times. It was called, "Actually, Republicans Do Believe in Climate Change." And Shane Skelton's our case in point. This one.
I'm not the only one.
I know.
I'm not the only one.
In this article, social psychologists Leif Van Boven and David Sherman outline some national surveys they conducted in 2014 and 2016 that found that most Republicans actually agree that climate change is happening and humans play a role in reducing carbon emissions would help mitigate the problem. Democrats agreed more, but the point is Republicans are mostly on board. So it raises the question, if Democrats and Republicans mostly agree about climate change, why do they disagree about climate policy? The research, which is published in the Perspectives on Psychological Science, found that the problem is not so much that Republicans are skeptical about climate change, but that Republicans are skeptical of Democrats, and that Democrats are skeptical of Republicans. And this tribalism leads to political fights over differences between the parties that either do not exist or are vastly exaggerated, according to this study, this research. So the study concluded the actual degree of political polarization on climate change is not the belief in climate change. It's more about the climate change policy gridlock is really about exaggerating disagreement for the sake of disagreement. The reason for optimism, they conclude, is that when Republicans put forward a climate policy, Republicans were on board because it was part of their, tribalism. If one of their guys put it forward, they were pretty much on board, and Democrats were more likely to get on board. So basically it concludes, Republicans are our only hope, because when Democrats put something forward, the partisanship kicks in and nothing seems to get done. Okay, Brandon, you're a Democrat. Is there any way in hell something's actually getting done with Republican leadership on climate change?
Not right now. I was having lunch with one of our listeners last week, and we were talking about how angry we are about what's going on in Washington, D.C., and she said to me, it's a question I get from some of my friends, how do you sit there with Shane and do this? And
Yeah.
I thought I'd share my answer. So we have to solve this, right? And I think there's two options. One option is we do it in a bipartisan way with Republicans. I would love to do it. That is the most preferred option. It is the most durable option. I don't know if that's possible, but what I do know is that I'm not going to find out that answer by just talking with my friends at the Venice Ale House. I wanted to talk to Republicans about this, and Shane is my friend, and I really respect him and admire him. So that's why we're doing this. The other option, if the Republicans can't get their act together, is to just do it ourselves. That will be harder, but I'm prepared to do that. I'm very active in the midterm elections, trying to raise money for Democratic candidates, and if that's the route we have to go, we don't then have a choice. And so the way I sort of think about it is sort of have two hands, right? One, my hand is outstretched, it's open. I want to work with Republicans, but the other hand is a fist. And if they're not going to get their act together, then I'm prepared to go fight for it.
Any quick response to that, Shane?
I think you sort of articulated, I think, what the problem is, what the tension is, right? Is that Republicans know that they're not getting support, that they're not, I mean elected Republicans, I don't mean, people like you and I who talk. They're not going to get support from people who care about climate, even the ones that are good on the issue, even the ones who are focused on deploying clean energy or some sort of carbon mitigation strategy. They're just not going to have a bunch of environmental NGOs out there using their grassroots networks to elect Republicans. And so when you say, and I know we've had this conversation, but if the alternative is trying to force them out of office, they need allies, right? They need to find allies who want to help fund their campaigns while you're helping fund Democrats. And that is the battle line. If you create, not you personally, if we create a scenario where Republicans have to sort of be against climate solutions because the alternative is to not get support from your primary constituency, but then also to get clobbered and thrown out of office, it's not really helpful. And as Julia mentioned in the study, I have one example. There was an amendment. It's a $10 million amendment. It wasn't a huge deal. That got passed to an appropriations bill last year for energy storage. And it was introduced by a Republican, guy named Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, wonderful guy. And that same amendment would not have passed. It just definitely would not have passed if a Democrat would have introduced the exact same text. There's just no way I think the Republican House would have approved additional spending for clean energy. So I think we know what the path looks like. We've got to find something that we can agree upon, because when you do, the Clean Power Plan or something through executive fiat, it gets tied up in courts or someone else gets elected and we roll it back. So now we're 10 years away from cap and trade and we haven't done anything. I mean, we haven't done anything at all on this issue.
You guys are in power. I mean, you can do that, and I'm glad that the $10 million was passed. And I don't think Democrats care who gets the credit for this. If Republicans want to lead and own this issue and solve it, we'll go along for the ride. We just care about the outcome, but it's not happening, and that's the problem.
And it didn't happen when Democrats had control and tried to pass carbon tax in 2008, 2009, or sorry, cap and trade rather. David, let's bring your voice in here. You have advanced the clean energy industry and bring the business perspective. I know you also have a lot of thoughts about politics. So when you hear what these guys are saying about getting Republicans on board and even emboldening Republicans to do more, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm a victim of my own experience. I was there in the 2008, 2009. I was part of CEO of a company that was part of a group called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. 28 major American corporations and 5 environmental groups, but big corporations like GE, specifically existed to get climate legislation passed at the federal government. The Democrats had 59 senators, House majority, and a new president who during the campaign had said climate change was one of his 3 major issues. And we got annihilated. The Democrats could sweep in 2018 into the House and Senate. They could win, Tom Steyer could get elected president in 2020, and it still wouldn't happen if we don't have Republicans. I'm just saying that as a fact. And so what I would say is it needs to be Republicans, but I think that one of the things an anecdote that I would share with you, which was very illuminating to me, was a few years ago, as we all know, the military and the intelligence community are very good on this issue. Now, normally that would meant something with Republicans, but that doesn't, certainly the intelligence community means nothing to Trump Republicans, right? In fact, that's probably a bad sign, that the intelligence community says this is.
We should get Putin for it.
Yeah, this is a major issue. Yeah, Putin.
Oh, jeez, come on, guys.
Well, at least Putin is still in the Paris Agreement. But anyway,
Zing.
so I got invited a few years ago to the Naval War College to speak to some fast-rising majors and colonels, and by Secretary Mavis, Secretary of the Navy. And before we went on stage, they presented a little film, and basically what they had learned was when the Navy first said, we want climate change to be a big part of what we do, the officers who, trend conservative in terms of their political views in the military, had trouble with it. But then they recast it. They showed this little film, and the Navy said, look, if we use more renewables, then we can spread our fossil fuel further, and our ships can go out, further and stay longer. And so they had like these Marine Corps officers saying, like, I like the Navy's push for, clean energy because it allows me to stay in theater longer and kill more bad guys. And I'm like, well, that's an interesting argument for climate change. But if that's what floats the boat of a Marine Corps major, then I'm in for it.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways where you can cast renewable energy in classic Republican terms. Solarizing your roof, monetizing it's private property. You're getting out from under the thumb of an intrusive state monopoly in terms of the utilities. So the places where public policy has been most effective, and you mentioned Georgia, was when there was what some consider an unholy alliance between classic liberal environmentalists and the Tea Party, because the Tea Party can believe a lot of the things that renewable energy, and so that's the sort of coalition that I think we need now. But more than anything, we need leadership that prioritizes this at a time when the country is just preoccupied with a bunch of other important, policy issues and personality issues and things like that.
And where I agree with the New York Times piece is the messenger does matter, and that's why we need more Shanes. And I want to figure out how to do that.
For sure. Well, Trump did actually come out in support of solar on the border wall. So that's one way he might get behind it.
The reality of it is the messaging is really hard, right? Like that's what we do for a living. I think that's a big part of what you do for a living. And it's really hard because it's really complicated. A lot of political issues can be boiled down to 1 or 2 sentences, and you're either with us or you're against us. It's a very clear, us against them. Climate, unlike other environmental issues, you can't see it. I mean, you can look at weather patterns, but it's not like, hey, I don't want that oil rig near, my beach. It's not something that you can point to and say, here's why we have a problem, let's sit down and solve it. You have to explain the science, you have to explain what's happening, why it matters, what could happen in the future, and how important it is to start addressing that, and that's really hard in politics. If you start explaining something, you're losing. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah. I want to talk about one specific race in Pennsylvania because it's a swing district and you have a very moderate Republican running there, Brian Fitzpatrick. He's the incumbent, and he put forward a carbon tax last month along with Representative Carlos Curbelo. So you have 2 Republicans leading on climate change, actually introducing some climate legislation. He's in a race against Democrat Scott Wallace of the Wallace Global Fund, and they have been working to empower women, fight against climate change, and create clean jobs. So you have 2 candidates with strong clean energy and climate credentials, if you will. the Republican actually has one of the highest scores, if not the highest, on the League of Conservation's voters ranking system. So to this study, which said that Republicans might be able to get something moving on climate in this time of partisanship, if you lose someone like Brian Fitzpatrick, the Republican, do you lose that leadership? And so should Democrats ironically be supporting the Republican in this race so that you keep the Republican leadership engaged on Capitol Hill? Because if the Democrat gets in, he'll surely be good on climate, but you won't have that Republican voice in the room. Brandon, what do you think? How do you think about that?
I mean, absolutely not. I mean, we've talked about this, we've touched on it in the past. It's like, that's a highly targeted race. Control of the House is going to come down to a district like that. And I mean, we're angry. I just see so much out there where Republicans, it's a double standard, it's hypocritical. They're supposed to be the party of national security, but you see all this stuff happening with Russia. They don't even want to look into it. I don't know what the conclusion is, but not wanting to even explore it and look into it, I think is really dangerous. Republicans are saying they're the party of states' rights. Look what happened with the cafe today. We'll talk about it more in the show, but they want to take away California's waiver to have higher standards to have less air pollution. So I don't understand that. And we felt like in the Obama administration, we were proposing very moderate, almost Republican ideas to deal with this. We didn't start with a carbon tax. We didn't start with Medicare for all. We said, okay, let's compromise. Let's do Romney Care, which was Bob Dole's health care plan. Let's do cap and trade, which was George H.W. Bush's, plan. And the Republicans wouldn't have anything to do with it. So that's why I'm skeptical that they're going to lead on this. And that's why people are angry. And you see, what's going on out there. And I think we need to have, Democratic control of the House. And that's trumping right now the climate policy.
But anger doesn't solve problems, right? Anger helps win elections. And I think you make a good point that Democrats are upset and they want Republicans out of office. And I get that. I mean, I think a lot of people underestimated how upset a lot of Republicans were during the Obama years. I'm not likening the two presidents. I'm just making the case that it wasn't like we were thrilled for 8 years.
Upset over us proposing Republican ideas? What was so upsetting?
I mean, maybe Republicans in the past had those ideas, but cap and trade was not popular on Capitol Hill or in America. There were a lot of things
Popular in China.
that weren't. Well, we're not China, right? But like I think the reality of it is that if you're angry, you can remove people from office. You can get people to vote. You can mobilize. You can do all that. But then, we're back here in 10 more years having this discussion. I had this conversation with one of our listeners the other day on the phone, and he said, yeah, but it's too urgent. It's too urgent to make, to have corporations lead and make investments and efficiency, and we don't have time. And I said, sure, but if you and I would have spoken 10 years ago, you would have said the same thing. We haven't gotten anywhere because we didn't compromise. So had we gotten something done in 2009, we'd now be 10 years into our 30-year plan. Instead, we did absolutely nothing, and we're going to be here in 10 years, and we're going to have this conversation again because someone's going to be angry that someone else won an election.
All right, wow. Okay. Well, so it kind of gets back to this issue of, do you vote for your cause purely? Like, say if climate's your cause, then maybe you do vote for someone like Brian Fitzpatrick in that race if you do take the study's findings that Republicans could lead on this. An interesting point on that, on cause versus politician, is the Kochs. Just this week, they announced they're no longer solely supporting Republicans, but they're going to focus on supporting their fossil fuel agenda. And that means that probably supporting some Democrats too. Free trade is one of their biggest issues, but you could see it almost, an interesting scenario where some Democrats maybe weaken their stance on climate because they're getting some Koch dollars. We don't know how it's going to play out, but it's interesting that they have chosen their causes over the political party. And it's led to this breakup with Trump in a very public way. Check out the tweets, super entertaining. I guess, Shane, to you first, what do you think of the Kochs changing their strategy like that?
I think they're really smart to do it. I think it goes back to what we were discussing a moment ago, where if you want to get issues dealt with, you've got to deal with the issues. And I think it was Kevin Kramer, who's running for Senate in North Dakota, that what spurred this with the Kochs was that apparently in a meeting of House Republicans, he said to someone, don't worry about the Kochs, they're going to fund us anyway if you're a Republican. And they resonated with them. And their view was, well, we shouldn't be a rubber stamp. We're always saying next cycle, next cycle. If we care about certain issues, we should invest in those issues. So I don't share their views on a lot of issues. I do on some. But I think it's smart to say, Fundraising is very, very, very hard. It's very difficult, and it's very time consuming, and it's what politicians spend most of their time doing. So if you can find an ally who wants to help you fundraise and give you money because you support their issues, it's going to be an effective tool. And I think it's the right way to go. And what I think is people who want climate action should be doing similar things. They should say, hey, we're participating like we always do, but we're not going to blindly elect either party. We are going to make it appropriate. We're going to make it fun to be pro-climate. It's not going to be something that you get beat up on in the campaign trail. You're going to be running on this stuff. And I wish Democrats, or at least liberal-leaning donors, would do that.
Yeah, to be clear, the Kochs are anti-climate action. We're using this as more of the principle of the cause versus the politician and the political group you support. But yeah, let's just, for the record, not conflate the two things of Kochs and acting on climate.
But it's going to be interesting, the impact on the midterm elections, because there's going to be some candidates now that they're not going to fund. The Senate race in Indiana is really important to who's going to control the Senate, and it looks like they're not going to support the Republican, candidate for Senate in Indiana. And by the way, for our listeners who've been listening to the show, they know that Shane and I have a big bet on Texas. And a recent poll came out, showed my man Beto, he's making moves, 6 points is that poll, and another one was 2 points. So Shane spotted me 7 points, so I'm looking pretty good, but I think Beto's got a chance to win the whole thing.
Yeah, I spotted him 7, and I thought I was walking. I didn't even think about it. I was just trying to pick out where so the bet was that you have to take the other person to dinner anywhere they want. They can order
Julia gets
anything
to
they
come no
want
matter
and
what.
pay. Yeah, no, Julia gets to come. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm going to pick the nicest restaurant in LA, and Brendan has to buy me dinner. Why would he do that? And now I'm seeing these polls, and I'm not feeling as
The
great
blue
as I
wave
did.
is coming. To be clear, that's Beto O'Rourke up against Ted Cruz in Texas. Shane, you mentioned the corporate influence and that would maybe not be acting fast enough. We've talked on previous episodes about the role of corporations in advancing climate change and clean energy policy. David, you interact with that community a lot. Is what corporations are doing to tackle climate change enough? Do you think of it as being sufficient in the meantime, or is it just one step? And then the follow-up is, what do you think the corporation's role is in the political world? Do you think they could have a bigger impact there?
Well, I think there's for the most part, and to answer your last question first, I think it would be better if there was a lot less money, in politics than there was. So, but you had presented the previous question as you vote for policy versus personality, and I actually think there's a third category that rises to the surface this time. I don't want to sound too sappy about it, but it's about core values. And who are we as a people, and who best reflects us? The traditional Republican Party and the Democratic Party, in the post-war era, they both reflected, I think, American core values. I personally don't feel that Trump Republicanism reflects at least who I am. And I mentioned this in answer to your question about corporate core values, because one of the things I was proudest about, our company was spread all over the place. We had 11,000 employees, but every single employee at NRG, we all had a set of core values, and to make it easy, it's an acronym, STRIVE, safety, teamwork, respect, integrity, value creation, exemplary leadership. I had to work on the E because if you put it as an L, it sounded like strivel, which wasn't best. So, what you see now, and I think almost every big corporation has embraced this idea that their soul is a set of core values, and one thing or another that the Trump administration has done has offended those values, and so you see the CEO group disbanding and things like that. And I think it's probably the biggest setback to the climate change movement is not actually that Trump pulled the United States out of Paris, but it's just climate change has been lost in the debate of worrying every day about what Trump tweeted that morning. There's no discussion about what our obligations are. And only the most committed CEOs want to stand up right now and say, my company fundamentally believes in X when he or she knows that X is something that the Trump administration and the laughably identified environmental protection agency at this point what it stands for. And so I think that's the big loss, because buying power, if I sent a speech last year, if I could have one job right now, I'd like the 100 largest corporations in the world in terms of energy consumption to aggregate their energy demand and give it to me, and then let me go around and source that, because, suppliers, we live in a world right now of energy surplus, which we didn't through the 70s, 80s, 90s. And the buyers have all the purchasing power in the world. And if they got together and said to the utilities, the power companies, the oil and gas companies, I'll buy energy from you, but it can't be associated with carbon going into the atmosphere. So you figure it out. That would change behavior much more quickly. And, right now, for every Unilever out there that's, conveying that message, we will not do business we will not buy electricity from anybody, unless we're sure it's, carbon free, by the year 2030. So you got 13 years to figure it out. For every one of there's 50 companies that are sitting on the sidelines. And so I think that's really an important thing.
Interesting. One company we've actually seen play a role in climate policy, oddly enough, is Exxon. They have come out backing, I mentioned a carbon tax earlier, and there are two other Republican-led or bipartisan, at least, efforts to pass a carbon tax that all have happened in this year, recent months. So it's kind of interesting. There's some momentum building around that. The Climate Leadership Council is one of the groups. Americans for Carbon Dividends is the other, and then I mentioned the carbon bill. Exxon has supported these policies. A lot of oil companies have. And so in some ways, okay, great, the oil industry is getting on board with climate action even, wow. And then you kind of look at some of the language, and in two of those proposals, not the bill, but the other proposals, it would actually provide liability protection for fossil fuel companies for any carbon emission related claims. So they would be off the hook for any future lawsuits related to climate change, but they would have to pay a carbon tax. But of course, they're maybe influencing how high or low that carbon tax would be. So you have these kind of conflicting things, maybe if you're a Democrat, because you're thinking, okay, carbon tax is good, finally, let's get a step forward, great. But if that rider is kind of in there, are you maybe putting yourself in a corner where you can't take legal action against fossil fuel companies in future? Shane, I know you've thought about this a little bit. Do you have any thoughts about that effort? Does it undermine the Republican effort, the fact that oil companies are also backing this, or no?
I think yes and no. I think you can't, the way that someone wants to do this, right, is that you put a tax on carbon that's affordable, and then you can socialize the cost because you can pass that through to your, millions of consumers. So they get that. Whereas if you get sued and are held liable for some, insane amount of money for climate damage, how do you deal with that? That's a huge corporate risk. So I get why they're doing it. I think for Republicans, it's tough because what you don't want to do is get muddled up in an effort like this that I think is more insincere than anything. I think you can't give a company, any company, for any reason, just liability waiver for anything. I just don't think that makes a ton of sense. And so I think the details are probably not good. They're not where they need to be. I think what it does do, though, is most people don't read the details. So to the extent that you get Republican circles talking about a climate solution, you get big companies sort of talking about this casually. I actually think that will help normalize it quite a bit over the next few years. So I don't think Exxon's proposal is going to win the day, but I do think that when Republicans, just like Democrats and everyone else, talk about this issue casually all the time with corporate interests and with their voters, then you've normalized it, and now it's just like any other issue. You can act on it.
Brandon, I know you were starting to read that huge 30,000-word New York Times Magazine special all about climate change. It actually just came out, and it goes into a lot of the detail of where we got off track. Like 30 years ago, Republicans and Democrats were actually all on board with climate action. So tell us more about.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed that I haven't finished it. I was actually too busy beating Shane at bowling last night, and there's a shuffleboard out there. I was beating him at that as well, so I didn't get to finish the article. But it's fascinating. I highly recommend everybody read it. And I've gotten to this point where Exxon was about to go all in on renewables and solar, and I don't know what happened. And I think that can be something that this show does, is for Shane and I to put our heads together and figure out how do we get back to where we were, which I didn't realize in the late 70s and early 80s. There's a lot more consensus and sort of a more unified approach to this. And how did this go off the rails? And how do we get this back on track?
I mean, it became. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It became political, right? I mean, when the clip that you sent me, and I'll admit that's all I read of that article, was that that they said we're going to own this new energy model of the future. That was an opportunity, an investment opportunity to own a market that was going to grow. And now, I mean, climate is a lot more, I think, more often mentioned in political discourse, not policy discourse. People use it as a bludgeon to beat up their opponents. And so it's really hard for companies to get involved in an issue that's very politically sensitive. And clearly they're not, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and one of my takeaways from the, being 3/4 of the way through the article is, I mean, I didn't realize that even before I was born, there was a CIA classified report that said, climate change is a huge deal, and the impacts, on our society and economy are almost incomprehensible. So we've been thinking about this. Scientists have been on this for decades, and we're still stuck. And that's why, David and I were sort of debating this about Democrats before, we got on the show today. I'm excited about women like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who just won that race in New York. She's bold. She's got the guts to say this is what we need to do. And we've been messing around for a couple of decades. And I'm like, let's give Alexandria a chance. I'm all for that.
David, what were your thoughts about Alexandria or anything we've just said?
No, I have no thoughts on Alexandria, but to the point about Exxon. I mean, I was CEO from about 2001 to 2015, and one of the things that you noticed during that period was how much issues that normally are should be in the government domain suddenly get put on big corporations because implicit, second to the military, like big corporations are actually seen as problem-solving, apolitical organizations. And so whether it's, basic education in America, you see all these CEOs starting to, intervene. And fortunately, as opposed to when I started in 2000, which was sort of the transition out of the era of, command and control, rule by fear CEOs to the nurturing CEO model, which we have now, most CEOs were actually inclined to care about issues more than just their company's bottom line. So what I see with Exxon, and I don't want to cast aspersions on Exxon, but first of all, I'm not a big believer. I don't think a carbon tax works. I know that people say it'll work. I'm an old school cap and trade guy. It worked for SOX. It worked for NOx. I don't know why it can't work. A carbon tax, they will misprice it, and it won't affect if they did it. And initially, like when Republicans start proposing carbon tax, my first thing is most Republicans won't vote for anything that has the word tax in it. So they're just trying to pretend like they are in favor, and they're not. And initially, when Exxon came out in front of a carbon tax, I actually attributed that to them, that they were in favor of it because they knew it would never pass. But the second thing I'd say about Exxon is I'm not saying they're doing this, but you'll see that I actually am saying that they're doing this, is that we have to be very careful about greenwashing. Because if you look at the PR campaign, the advertising campaign that Exxon put on during the last Olympics, they spent something like $40 million to show how they were using algae to capture carbon on. Well, we did an algae experiment at NRG, and it's terrible. I mean, it's a nice theoretical idea, but it's not going to happen. I could tell you why some other time. But at the same time that they were spending $40 million trying to let everyone in the room think how green they are, their CEO at the time, Rex, actually went and said, look, algae's not happening. It's 5 to 10 years from even being close to demonstration stage, while his advertising people are saying, hey, look at what all we're doing in algae. So we have to be worried about people wrapping themselves in this green cocoon and not doing anything. And then the biggest issue for all the major oil companies is they have no place to go. When I got fired for trying to make the transition of NRG from brown to green, one of the CEOs of the very, very largest oil companies, called me up and said, look what happened to you. He said, you could never make your renewable business matter to investors relative to the size of your conventional business. And then you got fired. Our company is 40 times larger than yours. If we concluded that a software program to make your house energy efficient was the future and went to the marketplace and said, this is what we're going to do, the investors would say to us, go back to, no, if we want a software company, we'll invest in Microsoft or something. Go back to punching holes in the earth until we decide that, we're not going to hold your stock anymore. So they have a big issue that's hard for them to overcome.
Interesting. Okay, I want to pivot in our remaining few minutes here to talk about the corporate average fuel economy standards. These are the rules the Obama administration put in place to make cars more efficient. They were targeting to get to 54 miles per gallon, roughly a doubling of fuel economy by 2025. Just today, the Trump administration released their proposal that would freeze those standards at about 37 miles per gallon at 2021 and no longer get up to that 54 mpg. They would also revoke this legal waiver that California has granted and is also followed by 13 other states that allows them to put more stringent pollution standards in place for cars. So this is big controversy. You totally have a huge climate impact, obviously. Getting more efficient cars on the road has a direct and a large impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess this kind of example is, I think, one where it's so hard for Democrats to get on board with anything Republican, White House, Congress, whatever, because it just seems like the whole strategy is to block and undo, block and undo. We have yet to see them actually step up with anything of value. And I think this is one of those examples.
Well said, Julia.
Tax reform.
Okay, Brandon, I'm just going to overlook that. What do you make of the cafe standard situation?
I mean, this is something that we were really proud of. I was in the White House the first year. I was there. This is what leadership looks like. The president and his chief of staff at the time, Rahm Emanuel, they got the automakers, the EPA, the Department of Transportation in the Roosevelt Room. They said, get a deal, get this done. Nobody's leaving until we get something done. And the guy who's supposed to be the art of the deal, is flailing at this. I don't know who supports this. The automakers are saying that they don't want this, and the people don't want it. So I don't understand why they're doing this. It just seems silly.
They got, as you know, and I don't know if you'll admit, they got dealt a bad hand. I think there's no reason to roll this rule back without any sort of thoughtful replacement. I know we've talked about there's a number of ways you could reduce emissions from the auto sector that are really thoughtful, and you could partner, like you said, you could partner with innovators and try to find a good rule that minimizes cost to consumers and helps encourage new technologies. But with the CAFE standards, what often is not mentioned when I talk to people on your side of the aisle is that there was supposed to be a midterm review. There's always a midterm review. And they were going to go, you go back in, you see if the standards that you set were achievable, if they're going to continue to be achievable for the next 5 years. And when they expected that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election, they weren't worried about it. They could do the review and take as much time as they needed. Then right after Donald Trump won the election, they just went through and said, yep, we reviewed it, it's good, we're done. And they didn't do the work. And so they could have been more honest about where we were heading with CAFE, and I think states like California would have been more willing to have discussions with the Obama administration than they're going to be with the Trump administration.
I think it's important to note, too, there was some internal battles within the Trump administration. As we understand from some reporting, Andrew Wheeler, the current head of the EPA, was seeing a pathway to keep the standards in place, perhaps for legal reasons, or just thought it'd be less messy than getting into this legal battle with California. And the DOT, Department of Transportation, also weighs in, and they were more gung-ho for putting the stall in place. So it's interesting to note that even within the Trump administration, not everyone's necessarily in lockstep. We don't know the details, but that is what we're learning. So,
Shane, are you worried that if we don't, the Chinese are moving super aggressively to electrification. They're going to ban internal combustible engine vehicles, and we're, pulling back on CAFE now. Are we going to lose this market to the Chinese? Are we going to have to bail out the automakers again then?
Well, that's why I say I want solutions, because I'm, as you know, very much with you on electrification. So I'm not upset that they're not going to keep the current CAFE rules in place. I just wish they would have taken an affirmative policy step to do something like that. I think electrification, and we'll talk about this in a future episode, we always talk about what we don't like on the podcast, but we're going to do an episode where we actually introduce ideas. We can hold ourselves accountable for talking about what good changes could be made. What should Republicans and Democrats be doing? So we can talk a lot about electrification then. But yeah, I am worried about it. I'm worried that no one is seemingly putting, David made a good point earlier, that there doesn't seem to be a big plan where these rules and regulations are steps towards that plan. So I think it would make sense to say, what's our goal here? as a policy, whether it's in the transportation sector or, you know, environmentally or energy-wise, and then start using these rulemakings to walk closer to achieving that plan. And I just don't know what the plan is right now.
David, what's our plan?
Well-
But think forward to 2020, future elections. How do we get something happening here? And do Democrats need to step up and really take the mantle here, or Republicans?
Well, can I,
Move us forward.
Yeah, no.
Make us feel better.
Well, just, I mean, I'm sorry, I like where Shane was going with this. I mean, this cafe thing today is just smacks of just yet another, well, I'm just going to do it because Obama did it, which is, you know, that to me, having spent some time in the British parliamentary system, you know, Tories come in, they undo what Labour did. Labour comes in, they undo what Tories. We like to think as a country we're building on something, and it's if they had come in and said, well, we're getting rid of the cafe standards because it's better for the environment, it's better for everyone if this vision of an automated shared service transportation future where there are 50 million cars on the roads of America rather than 300 million, that will be much better for the environment and local air quality than just going to 54 miles. Then at least you could, okay, so there's a plan, there's something tied to that, but there's no plan here, there's just undoing what Obama did. So I think one of the most important things right now, I mean, this election's important, but is I'm very focused on the idea that 2020 presidential election, climate change has to be on the agenda. And the problem with Democrats is that Democrat candidates, they all believe in the same things, and they're all the right, good things that they believe in. And so since climate change doesn't poll well with the population, it never gets addressed. It wasn't addressed with Hillary versus Bernie, because they had the exact same position, and climate change was number 12 on the issue list. And so what I'd like to see happen, I'd like to see all these environmental groups that are energized and angry is get behind an overtly climate change candidate, so that at least when every presidential candidate should always be asked the question, why are you running for president? It'd be nice if someone answered, I'm running the president because climate change is the transcendent issue of our time and the last 4 years. And I'm not running as much against Trump Pence as I'm running against Trump Pruitt Wheeler, and right now, I mean, I don't know who that candidate is. I mean, there'll be 30 people. The perfect world would actually be if Bloomberg challenged Trump on the Republican side, and then there was a real climate change candidate on the Democrat side. So at least we got the issue back on the table, because we've suffered for 2 years now of the issue just being wiped off the table.
A lot of people, though, really quick, I'll be very quick, but a lot of people are happy with Wheeler. I'm one of them, but I mean,
It's been like 2 weeks.
well, that's my point, though. but so no, that
I
is my
mean,
point,
compared
though.
to Pruitt, maybe the worst public servant in the history of the United States.
But you said
I mean, straight out of the Warren G. Harding administration.
To run against Wheeler, I'm saying he's doing things that people like, even on the left, already. No, it's early, but he's posting his calendar online. He didn't go forward with that glider rule. I mean, my point is, how are we running against him? What has he done so far?
What kind of mattresses does he like?
We'll never know, luckily, right? Because he's going
Hopefully
to run the administration or the EPA, I think, effectively. But I just think it's too early to say we got to run against him, right?
Well, I mean, I got to admit, in the same way that you like the young candidate from Queens because you think she'll galvanize the Republican base, I was really disappointed when Pruitt resigned, because I thought, man, he's just so evil. We need that guy to last at least until November, so that
We are running out of time.
He'll be alive in all the campaign ads, I'll tell you that.
yeah, hopefully.
All right, I'm going to jump in. The way we end each show is to have each of our co-hosts say something nice about the opposing political party. So very briefly, Shane, what do you got?
Governor Jerry Brown. Wildfires are a huge issue here, but also in California, and it's going to be a mess trying to figure out how to sort all this out. But I think these utilities are going to be critical in California's clean energy plans. And so I think the fact that Governor Brown is spending political capital when he's on his way out the door to try to broker some sort of a durable fix to wildfire funding But I think liability funding, I'm sorry, but I think what will also happen is utilities will come out of this stronger, and they'll be able to deploy more clean energy and address some of the underlying climate issues. So I just think it's really cool that he could phone it in for his last few months, but he's working hard to get this done by the end of the month, which is when it needs to get done by.
Definitely controversial, but we'll have to save that for another episode, is what exactly to do about the wildfires and the role of the utilities. Brandon, close us out here.
So in the White House, there's an office called the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. And the head of that office is basically the president's top science advisor. Under Obama, there's a Dr. John Holdren. He was terrific. So Trump just nominated somebody to head the OSTP office, so it'll be his top science advisor. And the gentleman's name is Kelvin Droegemeier, and he's actually been outspoken about support for climate research and support for climate programs. So this is a good sign. So somebody that's in there advising Trump who believes in climate change is a step in the right direction.
Great. All right, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Political Climate. I'm Julia Pyper, Brandon Hurlbut, Shane Skelton. Thank you so much, David Crane, for joining us this episode. And thank you guys for listening. Until next time.
Yes, thank you, David.